right, I think we should do it. I'm watching the attendee number, and it's great. It's a great audience, and so thanks for joining, everybody. Thanks for joining the session, securing the evolving connected building. We'll start by I'm just gonna try to help get everyone familiar with the webinar tool. Please post all of your questions in the Q&A tool, not in the chat, because that will make it easier for us to answer them. So once again, if you have a question, please use the Q&A tool, not the chat. The track will run for a minimum of 55 minutes, and we'll have you out of here on time. It would not be possible to run this virtual conference without our sponsors. Thank you to Hive MQ, Ursa Leo, Fortinet, Building Cybersecurity Organization, and Trend Micro. Before we get into it, I'd like to tell you a little bit about IIoT World. IIoT World is the leading authority on industrial IoT. IIoT World is a digital media outlet bringing the latest industrial Internet of Things, virtual conferences, and content to a global community of over 283,000 decision makers and influencers. IIoT World focuses on delivering daily insights on the industrial Internet of Things across multiple verticals. Online, IIoT World curates a series of virtual events, such as this one, that punctuate the calendar and draw thousands of delegates, including IIoT World Days. So, without any further ado, let's meet our panelists today. And what I'd like to do is just go across the chart and ask Rick and Ben and Shailesh to introduce yourselves. Rick, would you please start?
Absolutely. I'm Rick Peters, the CISO for Operational Technology in North America for Fortinet. Been working in this business now for about 4 years, and then prior to that, just shy of 4 decades with the U.S. intelligence community.
Thanks, Rick. Ben?
Hi, everyone. I am over at Dragos. I lead the services and R&D team at Dragos. We're focused on securing critical infrastructure and industrial control systems, including IoT, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Ben. Over to you, Shailesh.
Hi, so I'm with Intel, and with Intel, I'm part of our networking and edge computing group, and I lead our consumer industries group. And by consumer industries, we really mean retail, banking, hospitality.
Great. Thank you, Shailesh. And everybody, I'm Bill Noto. I'm the Director of Segment Marketing for OT at Fortinet. Very pleased to be here with you all today. Thank you for the time. So let's get into it. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask a series of questions, and the panelists will discuss. So what are some of the compelling trends behind the smart movement? And Shailesh, would you please kick us off to start? What's
Sure.
Intel's perspective?
Thank you. So when I see smart movement, really, at least for me, it's about being responsiveness and adaptability of our environment. And if we look at a very high level, that's not necessarily a new concept, right? We were able to do that in old days as well. But what's new now is that we now have technology that allows us to scale, right, our promise of adaptability and our promise of responsiveness of our environment at scale. And that's the biggest promise. And some of the examples really is how we can go drive the adaptability and responsiveness of our environment. In this case, buildings is this entire transformation of the infrastructure, right? Which includes both, right? Our operational capabilities like HVAC systems and security and power, but also equally important is the experiences that we deliver to consumers who are visiting those, or even any one of us, if we are living in our buildings too, is how do we make them responsive to them, deliver experiences that are personalized. An example I can give in context of operation, even a simple use case like we all use in our homes, like Nest, right? If we take that example where it adapts to our need while delivering better efficiencies of energy use, right? And I can extend the same idea to any of our infrastructure and operation capabilities. Personalization is really about, like we see a lot of trend everywhere in our buildings. You have technologies like digital signage and other screens, and that can adapt to people. We have content, right, that can be personalized to their environment. And so these are some of the examples and trends that are driving this notion of what I call the smart movement in our modern world. Because I believe we are smart always. Our buildings are smart before too.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think of the thermostat as sort of my classic, how
Yep.
do I explain controls to someone who
Mm.
doesn't necessarily understand ICS? And it's interesting to see that example getting more intelligent. Ben, did you want to comment from Dragos's side?
Yeah, so certainly Dragos is focused on the security side of essentially what is just becoming a more and more interconnected environment. And oftentimes, like in the early days, right, like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, these systems were made to be standalone, and over time they become more and more interconnected. But one of the aspects that I would kind of dub smart, quote unquote, is not only are these environments becoming more connected, but the backend systems are becoming more interconnected. So what I mean by that is I have a electric car, so I have a charger on the side of my house, and I can opt into sharing those that activity with the charger with my utility. So I'm actually on the back end. They're not individually communicating with my smart meter, but in the back end, those systems are becoming more and more interconnected and interwoven. And I see that as a significant part of what this idea of smart is.
Very excellent. Great example. And Rick, how about you? What's your thought there?
I'm already smiling because I've been listening to the comments from Shailesh and Ben, and I'm foot stomping them because they're going, yep, they're all over it. The only thing I would add, and maybe it's obvious, but I think it bears mentioning is, underneath all of this, right, what's driving this is the appetite for data. It continues to grow, and then you draw all of these connected resources across a very complex stack, right? Because you're talking about systems of systems within these environments, and you realize you have a huge responsibility, from maintenance all the way to the customer experience. Everyone's expecting performance, security. They want confidence in the environment. They want to be able to trust the environment. So, underneath it all is this necessity for more, and our consumer will accept nothing less.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Let's go to the next question. What are the key technologies enabling smart buildings, campuses, infrastructure, and cities? In this case, Ben, maybe you could start. Give us the smart grid context, perhaps.
Yeah, so I think it's really helpful to like kind of look at past his prologue sort of aspects. I certainly, not to date myself, but when I was a kid, I remember my dog barking at the person walking by the house to gather the meter information manually as he walked by. Uh,
Hmm.
by the time I was graduating, that was no longer a person. That was advanced meter reading. So a truck was going by, and shortwave radio was one way pulling the information off the meters. And by the time I actually had a job and was in the industry, back in the 2009 timeframe was the American Reinvestment Act. And that pushed a lot of investment in smart metering or advanced metering infrastructure, which is not just one-way shortwave communication. It is bi-directional communication that allows for continuous reading of the meter, as well as being able to enroll in things like e energy management systems, where during hot days you can lower the load and allow the utility to do that. So that's been like kind of the progression of
Mhm.
where we're heading, is just moving to more control and more scale. Like if you think of an asset owner, not to go deep into electric, but when you think of an asset owner, a utility, before smart metering, they were managing control points of maybe dozens of substations. And then you add in smart metering, and you're talking about hundreds of thousands of data points across all their customer base. So that's really where you get into the scale aspect of just the amount of data that's continually being collected by these systems.
And I can't help it, but I'm thinking about your car charging situation and wondering if you've got enabled a time of use capability where the utility can say, hey, you know what? The power to charge your car is cheaper at 3 a.m. when there's less load on the system than it is at, say, when everyone's running their air conditioners or their OLED televisions at the same time.
Absolutely. And
That's
I didn't actually enroll in that program because I'm a bit of a paranoid person, but I would have received a bit of a benefit in my bill by doing that, so that they can have further control into there. So
that just tells me that the market incentives weren't right for Ben, right? So how, Shailesh, did you have a perspective? You could maybe talk about AI or ITOT convergence.
Yes, I can definitely talk about what I call the underlying technologies driving any of the infrastructure, whether it's grid or other operational systems. So I think we are all hearing about artificial intelligence, and the value of artificial intelligence is really being unlocked as a result of the convergence of what we call historically operational technologies, right? And then we had these IT technologies, and historically they kind of sit in the separate vacuum. They were thou shalt not talk. But when they started talking to each other, I think now we are able to kind of learn more about the environment from the operational technologies, right? So that's the data allowing us. IT can manage it. But other key technologies that is helping is the Internet of Things, right? And I gave Nestor a simple example from home, but if we expand that in our buildings, every device is a sensor now. It is a source of data. And if you can start pulling all of that information, start kind of making sense out of it, that opens up this whole new set of possibilities. And the simplest form, artificial intelligence really is about helping us predict things sooner, right? Or give us intelligence that, of course, we could have done it, but it would have taken us, I don't know, hundreds of years to get same information, or sometimes it will be too late. So I see that as one of the kind of the key technologies that are driving all of this underlying infrastructure. And just using a home example, I guess a simple one, and it is simple one, but just from purely operational, we talked about, Rick talked about grid. I'll talk about irrigation at home. Is in old days, I bought an old house. This neighborhood is beautiful. That's I bought it, but it's like 30-year-old house, and the leaks are common. And my neighbors are joking like leak of the week, but takes a while before I uncover the leak if it's either in the backyard irrigation system or sometimes in the house. And it's too late in a lot of cases, especially if it's somewhere in the house. Like I literally had a damaged wall once in my previous house. But now, because of the smart metering, I literally know within 2 days if there's a leak, because there's a pattern my city is detecting in water consumption, because they understand my water consumption pattern. The moment is abnormal, which is peaking high, I get a alert to start checking for it. And if I have abnormal activity, I know, of course, whatever I was doing, that's why the water consumption increased. But 90% of the time, there was no abnormal activity, means there was a leak. And then you can start diagnostics on it, where it is. Is it my backyard? Is it my house? And at least I've had now 3, which I fixed purely based on information. Is much less cost and damage, and also the inconvenience. So that's kind of my example of AI. And then of course we can talk about other, which is the whole network that's coming on board, like 5G connectivity and private networks that allows us to now deliver content much faster and cheaper and with much less latency. And especially in buildings, the delivery of content is kind of key aspect of the personalization, and network is an absolutely important aspect, right? So everybody's hearing about the 5G, but the benefits gonna start showing up when we talk about 5G, intelligent content or artificial intelligence to drive these efficiencies.
These are great examples. Thanks, everybody. Well, let's talk about bad actors. Who are the malefactors? How do they view the opportunity posed by the shift to smart infrastructure?
Yeah, I think from the Drago side, certainly we track multiple adversaries that have interest in disrupting critical infrastructure. Or on the flip side, something that's much more common is ransomware actors just simply looking for disruption of business. And there's a lot to unpack there, from opportunistic attacks that allow you to move very quickly from your traditional enterprise environment into some of what would be like specific around a campus. So like say HVAC systems or access control systems, and truly impact that and cause significant disruption to adversaries that are often aligned or resourced by nation states that have capabilities are actively developing capabilities to actually disrupt these systems. And the real challenge there is some of these systems, when we start getting into the industrial space, are rotating equipment, high pressure scenarios. There's human safety concerns there, and we've seen disruption of safety systems in order to actually damage refineries. That was back in 2017, as well as disruption of the electric grid in 2015 and 16. So there are use cases and prior art, and a lot of the activity groups. We're tracking 18 activity groups that have either the intent or demonstrated capability around these systems. They are all in a capability development mode. So this is only going to progress and get worse over time if we don't get in front of it and understand how to better protect and monitor these systems.
Rick, what would your comments be?
Oh boy, my head's full on this one.
Especially
it's
now.
a couple of points I think that are worthy. And in this question itself, I'd pick out one word from that sentence: opportunity. It's really what it's about. If you just consider the growth of capable adversaries out there today, and I think the ratio is like 3 to 1, for every one that goes off, another 3 very capable bad actors with no ethics at all join this campaign, right, to amplify and disrupt at the most opportune times. And they've certainly demonstrated that their capacity to do so over the last couple of years. You're seeing a lot more of it. Why? Because they're gaining access, and access is that key word, right, to being able to accomplish a mission. And they'll use all means to accomplish that. And from the inexpensive purchase to out on the market to using more advanced techniques, perhaps leverage a vulnerability that's a part of legacy technology that often exists in operational technology, right? You got some hardware and software that's been out there for decades. All of a sudden, you connect all this infrastructure, creates great moments to repurpose and use tradecraft that maybe you've had in the back of your toolbox for some time. And then, on the other side of that, right, we have intelligence-backed situational awareness, and that's a double-sided sword, right? We want to use it, as Shailesh was talking about before, using AI to develop and really enforce behavioral analysis as part of being able to understand the situational awareness in our environment is great, but we know it's also being purposed to accomplish the offensive mission. So there's a lot on our plates as we think about that shift, right, towards smart infrastructure, and it's amplified by just a much larger attack surface.
Much larger attack surface, so bigger opportunity. And I'm just thinking of like, well, in terms of smart infrastructure, what are the opportunities, right? So like a ransomware actor is trying to make money, and the risk or the downside of what could go wrong. I mean, I'm picturing like traffic lights not working, or a very tall building and the elevators are not working. Those seem like obvious ones. Or the emergency response system doesn't know how to respond, for example. Those sorts of things.
Yeah, you're going to realize a multi-thread attack and very quickly, right? Just for that very reason you just stated, you have a wide range of opportunity.
Okay, Shailesh, did you want to chat on this one too?
I can add a few things, like everything you mentioned, and on top of it, other aspect of this is like security system in itself, they are under attack. And I think the moment they can access those, now there's all sorts of this business critical information. Even if you can secure the operational part, all of us, every building, I think there's a unique advantage, and operations are trade secrets in some ways. So I see a big threat. We have seen like bad actors accessing HVAC in retail environment and getting access to, say, consumer data. So if you're talking about buildings that are in the context of, say, hotels, that hospitality, like some of our focus. So there is a lot of this CRM data, right? And the loyalty is built on it, our reputation is built on it. And the bad actors have opportunity where they're stealing of personal information. And not only they're going to hurt now our consumers who are visiting us and our buildings, but more importantly, the brand reputation itself is potentially at risk.
The brand's at risk. Yeah. Well, so let's start with Rick on this one. What role does cybersecurity play in the decisions for smart buildings, campuses, infrastructure, and cities, Rick?
It's a great question, but when I was reading this question again, it made me think of the timeline story that Ben shared at the top of the session. It was a great one, right? The transition and the transaction of how businesses change to be more efficient, be more cost effective, but of course, it extends the environment out that we have to protect. And so I'd say if you start with a structured, comprehensive approach to applying what we already know how to do well, right? Employ cybersecurity best practices. These are not necessarily new in many instances.
Mm-hmm.
But we also need to think about a sensible strategy to accomplish risk management. We're taking this on, and asking somebody to take on the challenge of managing all these assets, consequence engineering has to be a part of it. You've got to understand the state of, and achieve a state of readiness, understand how you're managing all of these assets across a very complex stack, right? Because there's a lot of different services that fall into that environment. So it requires more of an ecosystem approach, right? To manage that. And I'd say ultimately it gives you a way to pay attention to things like the privacy of data. Clearly important, but we don't always think about that necessarily when we start to think about the cyber physical, but yet it's certainly a part of it. And you start to think about, well, how do I enforce a containment strategy? Well, naturally you would say, let's put some segmentation in there so I can contain a moment where perhaps I've got a situation that's getting out of hand. So we have to use some of what we already know, and then we have to make it work within the operational technology environment. So I'd say that comes back to a point I've already heard about scalability, right? Mm-hmm. Transparency is really important, and you got to be fast.
Thanks, Rick. Shailesh or Ben?
I think I would touch on the word role. Is really challenging for many of our customers. Certainly there's an aspect of safety, and that is almost always owned by the engineer, whether it's a building engineer, whether it's a power systems engineer, whatever type of facility it is. It's an engineering role. And they're largely the ones that own the technology and the execution and of these systems. Security plays a role in safety, but it's never traditionally been part of that conversation. It's been part of the IT conversation. Mm-hmm. There's often a distinct separation between those two roles, and often they can be quite at odds with each other as far as who owns the security and where that delineation is. Mm-hmm. And so when we start talking about risk, which I think is very appropriate on what are the risks of these systems and how do we mitigate and reduce that, there right now, often there is not an actual clear owner of who owns that risk today within the organization itself. Is it IT? Is it the engineering team? And that's led to a divergence of understanding at even the board level or the executive level of just what is the risk, that there's no clear answer to that because there's no clear owner that's really driven it forward. So that's been a challenge of the state of security within many of these systems, which is largely ironic that these systems are monitoring and collecting data in order to have an outcome, right? Whether it's consumer based or generating power or what have you, but nobody's actually monitoring the security systems of these devices and this software, and that's largely the state that we see across the board.
It's interesting just in terms of how I think of like smart technology is kind of disrupting, being like a innovative disruption innovation. That's what I'm trying to say. And what you're sort of describing is it's also disrupting traditional roles and responsibilities within organizations. And it's a little bit of a, I don't want to say chaos, but it's a little bit of like a realignment is required to sort of figure out who's going to be responsible for the risk in the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Shailesh, any comments?
I think you pretty much covered it, and Bill, just building on what you just mentioned, I think there's definitely maybe a new type of roles is this convergence is driving new threats, but new capabilities. And it's not about like, hey, whether you move it to IT or operational technologies, it ends up becoming new roles
Hmm.
because that's the new skill needed now, right? Somebody who understands both sides of the world, which traditionally, I think, Ben, you were covering it, right? They were separate roles. And there's just, we didn't even understand each other's world, like almost like you may be talking like living in a different planet. So now this convergence is driving new capabilities, requires new skill sets, new resources.
Yeah.
A B, the
Training.
also awareness part. Like I just recently read the thing, the concept called team of teams that was deployed in Afghanistan, right, during our operations there. And it wasn't so much about command and control, right? Which is when we empower our employees, and then that became about giving them the right skill sets and capabilities and critical thinking. They are more responsive to defend those. And this is where I see cybersecurity coming in, new capabilities, new roles, but also building those skill sets so that our teams can effectively circumvent them no matter where they are, rather than one person's job and one team's job.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, that's a great observation and good point. Thank you for sharing it. Okay. Is there a rush to integrate and deploy smart infrastructure, given security hasn't been built in as a key ingredient to the benefit of the advanced technology? I have like an additional quote here from Ernst & Young's Global Information Security Survey from 2021. Indicated that 36% of the organizations surveyed include cyber teams as part of the planning discussion. Yet despite the increased awareness, Ernst & Young has witnessed a 77% worldwide increase in disruptive attacks. So if the cyber teams are more integrated but attacks are doing more damage, I guess, is that rush to integrate appropriate? So I don't know if this is, I don't know where to start. I guess I'll start with Shailesh.
Okay. Well, I can see that the notion of rush, but still, if you look at it, we are only at the beginning of a deployment of this smart infrastructure. A B, I'd also like to say, I think this is the future. This is inevitable, right? This is where we are headed. So we can just wait and see. Because if you really look at the threats, going back into the whole, starting from the first industrial revolution, there always have been threats, they just manifested differently. So the key here really is, the first is, I think we talk about the awareness, is there's a systematic approach where, yes, we can't just go start implementing and deploying this smart infrastructure. We have to take a very systematic approach. And the awareness part, I think Ernst & Young mentioned, is definitely the key. Is like, again, going back to the point I was making of teams and educating them, building capabilities. So people and awareness is the first aspect. Then we have to also make sure we have the right policies and procedures that are underlying this. And then we start systematically understanding the risk, because there's really no one size fits all, right? Every environment is going to bring some unique risk, and understanding those risks upfront is the key. And I think once we have that foundation, then I'll bias like, no, I think we should start deploying it, but rather than going whole hog and let's just do it one go, I go back to our scientific approach of, you start small, right? It's an experiment. You learn from it, and then you review all our policies and procedures and the risk, and then you learn from it and you iterate. And
Iterative, right?
Right, it's an iterative approach, and I call it scientific because that's how we did in our high school science. Is we set up experiments, we learn from those experiments, and then we iterated it, and then we build the next level of experiment. Yeah. We didn't just go right away. So it's really more about planning and strategically deploying the infrastructure, and not just stopping because there's a rush.
We see that in a lot of our engagements, actually, where someone does a proof of concept, they make sure the thing works as they want it to work, then they start scaling it slowly. So go from one site to 2 or 3, make sure, test again, continue seeing the benefits they're expecting, and then perhaps do a wider scale rollout. Rick or Ben, did you want to add any additional comments?
Yeah, I'm dying here. I love the segue Shailesh used to characterize it, because one of the things, and I'm going to kind of address one of the questions that's come in on the site at the same time, is this domain, whether you call it smart cities, campuses, buildings, whatever, it's less mature today than manufacturing or energy and utilities or transportation. It just is. Whether we want it to be or not doesn't matter. The reality is we're recognizing the fragility, right, of these connected environments and the absence of ownership and complete trust in how we're pulling all these assets together, which, right, are distributed in their responsibility from IT and OT, and that presents its own set of challenges. But I think, the management of that legacy and newly adopted technology is a challenge all by itself. And then, of course, we have the presence of administrations, our new administration, really driving hard into OT. So there's a lot of things going on. I think we have to apply a lot of what we already know and have learned. And I think, Shailesh, I was deriving that from your conversation is, hey, let's not forget what we've already learned along the way and figure out how to apply that good common sense engineering as we think about how to protect smart infrastructure.
If I were to add one piece onto it, I think it would be that risk calculus. Underneath that, there's the understanding of the threat. And the threats change, right? The threats are human based. It's not software. It's the human, the intent, the capability behind there.
Mm-hmm.
That's ever evolving while our technology is also evolving at the same time. In the challenge that we have when we're trying to assess risk is that traditional IT security hasn't had visibility into a lot of this infrastructure. Therefore, they don't know the poking and prodding of the threats, the capabilities that have developed around the threats. That's largely been unknown until very recently. And that's leading to, in many cases, bad decisions by some of these organizations on what their risk calculus is. So if you don't have good visibility into these environments, how can you detect malicious activity that's occurring within it? How do you find the supply chain threats that are dormant, the vulnerabilities that could be used by a threat? How do you identify those if you don't have access to gain visibility and understand it?
Well, that's great. Thank you, Ben. We're going to move on here. So how do you balance the growing appetite for data with an expanding attack surface and compliance guidelines? And Rick, I'd like to ask you to start.
Sure. Well, we've already qualified data as a commodity of interest, both by the corporate entity that wants to manage the assets and those who would seek to usurp, whether it's for reasons of profit, through extortion or exploitation for purposes of intelligence gathering and intellectual property theft or even sabotage. But all of that known, I said I think it's important, right, to proportionally balance your investment, recognize what you're trying to accomplish ultimately, right, to achieve this cyber physical resilience for smart infrastructure. So I think you think about a couple of things. You make sure you understand why you're doing it. What's your motivation? Are you bouncing off of a crisis or what you perceive to be a crisis? Or is this a part of a strategy that's well thought out that's going to allow you to achieve cybersecurity maturity and not have to go backwards? Are you considering means to automate your decision making as a part of this, being elegant and efficient in how you do that business? Likewise, are you really thinking about data at a little more of a micro level in terms of ownership and the protection of that, not just privacy of the data, but the fact that it's a commodity, right? It's a commodity that has a value when it's extorted, and it has a commodity in terms of how you do business and make smart decisions to be able to accomplish things efficiently. So there's that. And then the other piece, which you cannot ignore today, is in this domain, there's going to be a tremendous value in behavioral analysis, behavioral analytics, to enforce trust, to understand behaviors that are going on, and to posture yourself to be ready to respond in the moment, which will happen when someone gains access inappropriately.
What do you think, Ben and Shailesh? Any additional thoughts?
I think Rick covered it. Only thing I'll add is going back to just about the balance, right, in the growing appetite for data and balancing with the attack, surface attack is, and I think Rick, maybe you touched on it too, the need, the strategy, and key, like, why are we doing this? Because I do agree with that. So it's definitely this, everybody's talking about like data is the new oil. And I don't know, for 8-9 years we've been talking about it, and that's kind of created this kind of rush for everybody wants to collect more data and hold data, if you will, and using it as a bargaining thing. But really, data itself doesn't create value. So understanding why we are collecting data, what
Yeah.
are the business outcomes we are expecting, and I think we touched on a few of those things. It could be around operations, but having a clear understanding of
Yeah.
the outcomes, whether it's about customer experience or it's about our operations and infrastructure, then we collect the relevant data, data that's needed, and not just let's collect all the data and get
Yeah, I
it.
think that's a hugely important point. I saw that in prior roles. It's the just because we can doesn't mean we should
Yep.
problem. And I think also with many folks, exploring different hyperscaler options, there's like a realization that it actually, at the end of the day, the data is going on some physical thing somewhere, and there's a cost to it. Like, so you better know why you're doing it and what problems you're trying to solve before you start, or you're going to spend a lot of time making something work that might not be that valuable.
Exactly.
All right, Ben, are you okay with me moving on, or did you want to add to that?
No, I don't think the only thing that I would touch on is certainly from if you're part of the cybersecurity organization, you don't want to slow down your business, right? If you drastically slow down or halt your business, they're just going to remove you from the conversation. So it's less about in many ways for the cybersecurity team to stop something or put the brakes on something. It's more of how can we do this as well architected as possible that puts in as many controls as possible. That gets into some of the attack surface and compliance guidelines, I guess there. But oftentimes there is legitimate value into what's going on, and certainly you don't want to be in between business and value at the end of the day if you're part of the security organization.
That's a good point. You don't want to be between business and value. I'm going to make a bumper sticker that says that. So, how do you address the cybersecurity requirements spanning traditional IT and operational infrastructure like HVAC, signaling systems, fire safety? What are some thoughts there? And let's start with you, Ben.
I'm racking my brain on actual. Well, I guess the question's now around standards. Like, I don't think there are actually standards or compliance regimes around these systems. Like, largely, there are standards within the electric sector with NERC-CIP. There's TSA guidelines and security directives for pipeline industry. Everything else is pretty much free game. There's certainly open standards as far as 62443, which is an international standard around these systems and how you can securely architect these systems. But I guess I'm focused on the word requirements, that there's
Yeah.
not a whole hell of a lot of requirements around systems, especially as it relates to HVAC or fire suppression safety systems. They are
Surprised to hear that.
yeah. Well, if you think of a data
Like, I
center,
picture like the enunciation system that's like at the front door of every big building. You know what I mean? Where there's got, like the fireman going in the building can see where the fire is. So that's not there because someone thought it was a good idea. Like, that's got to be required, right? So I just have to
sure, but
assume
there
that.
might not be cybersecurity components that are baked into that, right? You
Right.
could easily put that on
Fair.
your corporate network or via Wi-Fi or other systems. There's nothing that's driving that aspect of it. There may be
Got it. Okay.
sensing and the standards around that from like a underwriter lab sort of situation, but not on the cybersecurity aspect of it.
Yeah, that seems like an opportunity for improvement, doesn't it? How about Shailesh? Did you have a thought there on consumer connectivity or?
I think I'll pass on this one.
Okay.
I'll offer one point.
This is the hot potato. Okay, go Rick.
I'll offer one point, and because everything Ben said is spot on. And so, to be consistent, because these are all important services. Depending on who you talk to, you're going to get different values. But the reality is they're all important. They're all a part of the environment that I'm intending to protect. So why not be consistent in your approach at looking at what it is you need to accomplish by adopting a framework and applying it across universally, right? So you could grab the NIST cybersecurity framework as an example and say, okay, I'm going to look at all of these kinds of things that I need to be able to do from identification all the way through recovery and make sure that I'm being consistent, right? And thinking through how I can prove my readiness in each of these spaces, right? Because we've talked about some best practices, which everyone knows about, but you've got to think about how to integrate, right? We talked before about being transparent. You cannot slow this down. If you're slowing down the business, you're going to get the ticket out the door very quickly. So you've got to be transparent. You've got to scale. We talked about that before. Scalability is huge. And you've got to be able to design it with speed as an intent because bandwidth's going nowhere but up, right? So we're having to process a ton of intelligence, a ton of data. So if you're not checking all three of those boxes and you don't have a consistent way to approach how you're examining each of these systems that make up the entire enterprise, you're going to have a difficult time.
Thanks, Rick. Well, listen, everybody, we have 2 more questions to go, and then we'll get to Q&A. So it's 12:40 Eastern time, so we've got about 20 minutes left in the call. So let's take 5 minutes for each of the next 2, and then go to Q&A. So, and Shailesh, we're going to start with you on this one.
Okay.
What's the impact of emerging technologies such as IoT and 5G on architectures overall? And I suppose with respect to IoT, you can also talk about IIoT, given our host.
Yes. And so I think I started on it, I think when we kicked off this conversation, I don't know, I was reading a comment earlier that we touched on the convergence of IT and IoT. And yes, I think it's an old topic and we've been talking about 10 years. The challenge now is that it's still not kind of happening at scale, right? So that's why I think this conversation is still relevant, is we have not yet maximized the value of this convergence of IT and OT. Of course, I think we've discussed some of the challenges and the cyber threat issue is definitely a challenge. Cost of technology is a challenge as well. But from my perspective, I think these technologies definitely has a huge potential, like IT and IoT when we combine them together. And now starting to automate our systems, trying to go make decision-making at scale, right? Delivering our operational efficiencies, right? And adaptability. To me, I think that's the key. This is the holy grail of adaptability in buildings where we haven't able to do that in the past at scale. We have done it in localized environments, right? Using what I call the analog ways. So that's the impact. And the 5G, just not because we're talking about the convergence of OT and IoT, we are talking about data, we are talking about artificial intelligence. There is no way we cannot talk about 5G, right? Because when we are talking about moving the data, and this data is moving between devices and it's moving between domains, right? It's moving from the premises that are sitting on the edge, it's the cloud, and then in between, we've got the networking edge as well. And so network starts becoming a bottleneck, but also a cost, especially like we were talking earlier, the data, there's definitely a rush. There's a data deluge. So how do we make decisions on what data do we need, what gets moved, and do I need metadata here and then move rest of it?
Right.
And so 5G becomes really, really important, a challenge as well, but it's an opportunity. So I see it's a convergence of now that we started with OT and IT conversation. AI is a kind of how we can benefit from it, right? So the convergence by itself doesn't help much. It was necessary, but AI creates that opportunity for us. Then the 5G is the pipe, right? That will then, even though we have the right AI, we have the AI models, we have solved all the 14 steps in somebody's ability to deliver an application that really leverages the artificial intelligence promise, but now we're bottlenecked on the network. So that's the 5G. So these are the capabilities I see with 5G, and the network in itself is gonna really deliver on the promise we've been talking about for the last 8 or 9 years.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Rick or Ben, did you have a comment too about other impacts of emerging technologies such as IoT and 5G?
So I violently agree with what Shailesh just proclaimed. I love this use of the term "holy grail" and to tie into this because I think it's on point. But I think adoption of emerging technology, and obviously technology is going to continue to grow and emerge, right, at an alarming speed. You've seen that already. I mean, obviously 2020 innovation rocketed, right, to proportionally respond to a global pandemic, right? And that applied to across industries. OT didn't get a free pass. And certainly in this space, everything we do has to have a knowledge and a thought in the business process, from scaling and being able to deliver the speed that's sustainable for the long haul, because OT is not looking to make changes often, right? They're trying to make smart decisions that are lasting. And so as you make those smart decisions to accommodate the technology, you have to think about it from both sides, because as you expand, you're also increasing the opportunity for the adversary to consider how to get on target.
I guess to throw my head in the ring, and like I'm challenged with this question, but I think of the heritage of the OT environments that I'm consistently working in on, say, a turbine that's 20 years old. That turbine has components to it, including computer systems that are supported and maintained under that. Like, it's not strapped on afterwards. It's all part of an encompassing solution. There's a lot of integration testing and support behind that. That used to be an emerging technology, if you think about it. So now we're adding more emerging technology, and it's just, but that lifetime for a lot of what we're calling emerging technology is a lot shorter than that turbine. So we're increasing basically the turnover of this technology in many ways that I don't think many of the facilities are quite ready for and haven't adapted to.
Yeah, I see it the same way. I see, for me, the short answer is increased risk, or at least increased perception of risk, because of the just newness of the technologies. I'm not to say that there are not benefits, but I also see, like, for me, I look at 5G, and I know there's private 5G and public 5G and so forth, but just from the public perspective and the IoT side, to me, it means, well, you might have heard of the Purdue model. We're just not going to use that. We're going to strap a sensor with a cellular antenna on it and send data directly to Azure or AWS and make something cool that will tell you when your CNC machine is going to break before it breaks. Like, and who knows in terms of what else is going to happen on that thing. So for me, I feel like there's a perceived increased risk. I don't know if that's a controversial hot take, but that's sort of what it feels like.
I think it's you're diverting your ownership of that risk, right? You're moving that to your up further the stack in your supply chain. So now you don't necessarily own that responsibility if it's being managed by a third party. But that third party now has much greater reach if there is a supply chain problem within their infrastructure that could affect all their customers, which affects the customer's customers. And there's downstream effects there that could lead into a pretty area.
Potentially, yeah. Okay, last question, then we're going to go to Q&A. So we're doing great. So, and Ben, we'll have you lead on this one. So what are one or two practical steps that an infrastructure leader for smart buildings, campuses, infrastructure, cities can apply to their environment? What are one or two practical steps that can be applied?
Shoot, I'll give you four. These four are consistent across all of our engagements. So as I do assessments across all of our customers, there are four that have for the last 3 years been the top four. It is poor perimeters. It is lack of visibility into what's occurring in their environment. It is third-party connections, and it is shared credential reuse between the enterprise environment and these industrial environments. Those are the four top findings that we consistently have across all of our engagements. If you tee into those areas, you're going to uncover a lot of, I'd say, opportunities for improvement that are going to drastically improve from opportunistic attacks to more sophisticated supply chain and other challenges.
So taking those four findings, what's like the first thing you do to address each of them, or the first, do you know what I mean? Like, so.
So
high level.
Largely removing AD. Do not allow your AD or other authentication mechanisms to be spanning into these environments. They should be isolated. They should have separate policies and configurations and not shared. That would be number one. Number two, deploy network monitoring, particularly that is capable of OT monitoring of the internal traffic, not just the border traffic, to understand when malicious or unauthorized commands are being issued and allowing you to have visibility of when they are being issued. And going to perimeters. Often there is a firewall there or some sort of component there, even if it's something like VLANs that are being used to separate these environments. Auditing that and understanding that you need both ingress and egress filtering that up and down the stack is super important. As far as the last finding, sorry, was external access. Many customers don't even understand that they have third-party external access into their environment. So just documenting where this exists, whether it is for maintenance and diagnostic purposes, whether it's for support purposes, they do exist in nearly every critical infrastructure or OT environment that we work in. Identifying those and understanding the controls around them will go a long way.
That's great. And Shailesh, any thoughts from Intel?
Yes, I think I'll go back to the earlier discussion we were having. Combining one was the risk you mentioned. And yes, I agree with that. However, I'll say, like I said earlier, there's always a risk. So I'm more optimistic. I think we are at the juncture where there's a value is real. And I also, like Ben mentioned, that triggered a thought about emerging technologies. You're right. I think in some ways they're not really emerging, and even if they are, the time spent is so short. So now technology has almost become utility. So what's new now is the promise of what this technology can do, the value it can deliver, and value kind of in a lot of different domains. It's just not like just in one domain. Only place it's limited now is our creativity. So with that kind of that promise of the value, and of course you have to manage the risk, my kind of the practical step would be, I think one I shared earlier, which is just taking a scientific iterative approach. Because we have to start, and of course, don't go like, let's go big. Start small and learn from it, iterate and go forward. So, but to do that, other practical approach, given that we have all this huge potential and opportunity, is I'm a big believer of kind of this collaborative approach of teams, right? Innovation is always what I call it's a team sport. It's not an individual sport. So get your teams together, right? So create an awareness. Education is important so they can understand. After that, we really put a lot of our smart people from organization in a room and bringing them from different domains. Like we were talking about the OT and IT teams together, but there are folks across our organization. You bring them together on a common outcome, and then using the creativity and ingenuity of our own teams is how we can unleash the information, and then applying that approach we talked about earlier.
Thank you.
And I've done that experiment, Bill, multiple times with my teams. People who are not in the domain, you give them little education, this concept called design thinking, right? Putting yourself in the shoes of the users and empathy, and you'll be surprised the creative solutions our team members can come back with if you bring a diverse group of people together.
Thanks, Shailesh. Rick, any closing comments on this before we go to Q&A?
I'm going to give it to you in 45 seconds or less. How's that?
Hit me.
I'm going to segue off of what Shailesh just said, because I mean, I absolutely agreed with the micro points that Ben shared, and then where Shailesh went. I said, it starts with breaking down the silos. And by that, I mean within and external to the business, because you don't want to try and solve these problems flying solo. It really requires, the fact that you have Dragos, Intel, and Fortinet on this call today amplifies the importance of building trust and partnerships, right? You have to be able to anticipate and work collaboratively, leverage that wealth of experience, and then deliver an integrated approach, right? Because that's going to achieve what we talked about in those dimensions of the solution space before. And then a second point would be, preparing for innovation. Consider the importance of ascertaining what constitutes readiness, and then think through that so that you don't compromise the steps you're taking. And then you get that sustained longevity in the solution, and you get all of the attributes we talked about before, scalability and speed.
Thanks, Rick. Okay, folks. I don't know if I'm screen sharing the Q&A panel from Zoom. I think I'm not, but can you just confirm that for me? I'm not. Okay, great. So there's a poll up to rate the session. So please do rate the session. We accept your 5-star reviews. Just kidding. But we are interested in your feedback. So let me take some of these interesting questions here. We've got time. I think we got a couple minutes. So we'll do as many as we can. And I don't know if I'm supposed to read the name of the person who asked it or not, so I won't. Someone named Todd said, the IoT devices are easy targets and are connected to the back end. What's the best way to protect these? Any takers?
I can take that one, Bill.
Sure.
So, best way to protect IoT devices are securing them right at the source. And we've talked about cybersecurity, and most of the attacks happen in the transit from the storage. And you secure right when we are collecting the data, and then kind of through the entire chain when it's moving. That's probably the best we can.
I see Rick nodding enthusiastically.
Fortinet's prior CISO used a term, he coined it, and I loved it. Because you hear zero trust talked about all the time, is earn trust. Every asset, application, client, user, whatever that touches your system on and off must earn the trust every time, right? Because to do anything other than that, opens that door, that opportunity. So spot on, Shailesh.
Thanks. Kevin asks, what is it going to take to harden the perimeter of the United States of America and other countries? What happens when machine learning / artificial intelligence become an even greater threat?
I saw that question. That's a heck of a question, because there isn't a perimeter really. Well defined. There's often not a perimeter for just a company anymore with the amount of interconnected communications that are occurring in supply chain and other dependencies. So I struggle to answer that question. I think foundationally, there's less and less of a perimeter on how you measure it. It's like the argument of, don't worry about that generation facility because it's not connected to the corporate environment. Yeah, it is. It has been for 20 years, and it's also connected to 5 other vendors. Like that argument doesn't exist anymore. I think
the zero trust approach is a sort of better approach perhaps than the perimeter hardening. Just from a philosophy point of view, it's a challenge, right? It's also a challenge because these things aren't like owned by one thing; they're regulated by different things.
But continuing to characterize what looks like acceptable behavior across the stack is very, very important, right? The speed at which we accomplish that, right? The scale at which we accomplish that becomes an imperative, right? If you're going to, I'll use the term, if you're going to outmaneuver the adversary, you've got to think like them, and you've got to be able to leverage all of this intelligence and use it, right, as the asset, not just a repository of data.
Okay, I'm going down to another question. This will be our last one. This is from Matthew. Given the state of control system security, which has lagged behind other markets by quite a lot, how do we craft smart cities and smart buildings to provide resilience and safety and avoid the spread of terror and confusion?
So the opportunity is that many of these environments are greenfield, meaning they're new implementation, and so you don't have a lot of the what I'll call technical debt of existing infrastructure that you have to deal with. So one, there's quite a bit of opportunity there, but from a state of control system security, it's absolutely true that you mentioned zero trust. Often control systems are 100% trust in that they will receive any command and execute it willy-nilly.
Yep.
So that is a challenge of the existing control systems, but that can be instrumented in unique ways in a greenfield environment.
Well, I want to thank the speakers and their amazing insights and knowledge. Thank you again to the sponsors. As your support ensures we have all of this great content to share. Thank you to the attendees for listening in and for your great questions. I wish we had had more time for more of those questions. And now it's time to move on to the next session, Cyber Risk and Insurance in a Smarter World. Hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks,
Stay safe.
Take care, everybody. Thank you again.